Thank you very much for your introduction and for inviting me to participate in this very important forum. I also attended the conference in Washington, and there were some highly productive ideas that came out of that, and we certainly heard some powerful addresses this morning. Originally, we were going to speak for 15 minutes, and now it's 5 minutes each, and we'll have a good dialogue, I'm sure. But it occurred to me that in terms of my presentation, there's one word I could use to describe the basis of the problem in North Korea and the potential solution, and that one word is China. I think China has played a very clever geostrategic game with North Korea over the decades, and not just recently. And that game is this. North Korea is, number one, a strategic security buffer between South Korea and China. Now, we all know, of course, that South Korea has aspirations to invade China. So therefore, it's important that China have this buffer. Obviously, that's an absurd proposition. And so the idea of a buffer between South Korea and China is a myth. That is not the primary motivation of China in supporting North Korea. Its motivation is that the United States and the West have been entirely tied up in knots over the North Korea problem for the last couple of decades. It has been a major diversion of resources, security resources, because of the North Korean threat, and it has been a major distraction for our diplomatic establishment. Moreover, it has enabled China to play the role of responsible stakeholder and good faith negotiating partner in the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And what that has meant in practical terms is that whenever there is a crisis, not in North Korea, such as the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, or human rights in China, or trade, or currency manipulation, the West, particularly Washington, is always tempted to say, we'd like to get tough with China, we'd like to pressure them to do the right thing in these other areas where they violate international norms, but we can't do it because we need them on North Korea. China has played that card effectively for 20, 25 years. We always need China on North Korea. But China never delivers on North Korea. Instead, it delivers its diplomatic support, its economic resources, its military guarantees to North Korea. The old lips and teeth language that emanated from the Korean War still applies at bottom. Whatever differences there may be between the personalities in Beijing and North Korea and Pyongyang, the fundamental policy is that China sees it in its own interests to prop up that regime. And they have played that card, as I say, for a couple of decades. We keep hoping, we keep saying, well, China will help us or China will solve it for us, but China never does, and it never will unless and until the United States imposes the kind of pressure on China, not just on North Korea, to get it to cooperate. That means sanctioning the Chinese banks, Chinese financial institutions, the so-called black market entities. There's a whole network of systems within China that funnel aid and support to North Korea, so that every time there is a Security Council resolution, the first thing which would sanction North Korea, the first thing China, and to a lesser extent Russia, but they're always there with China, the first thing they do is oppose the sanctions as being counterproductive, and they persuade the Security Council to water them down to make them more acceptable. Of course, being more acceptable means they also have less bite, less effect on North Korea. But then the second thing China does, even once the watered down version is passed, is simply not to implement them, or to facilitate the undermining of the sanctions. So we've watched this go on now, year after year, decade after decade. Dr. Malapart was right. The sanctions haven't worked. But they haven't worked because they haven't been fully enforced and implemented. And the reason for that is China and, to a lesser extent, Russia. So until we can change that calculus, Dr. Moon talked about changing the calculus, that has to change. China has to start realizing that it will pay a higher price for continuing its policy toward North Korea than it will by changing that policy and cooperating with the West in getting rid of this existential threat to South Korea, to Japan, and now to the United States.